All right, let's get back into chapter 2. So, how do you develop theories and how do you develop methods of interpreting the data that you find? Well, there are a lot of key figures that you can go back to try and isolate how to do this. And your book actually brings up one important person, worked primarily in Egypt and Palestine area in the late 19th, early 20th century. His name was William Matthew Flinders Petrie, often referred to just as Flinders Petrie, or Sir Flinders Petrie. And he actually was one of the pioneers in creating, as we saw in last chapter, seriation, different styles of pottery changing through time. He used that method to try and understand a cemetery that he was digging in Egypt that was not stratigraphically linked. And so each tomb was in it from its own time period, it put it in there, but they didn't have any stratigraphic relationships with one another. So he couldn't tell which was earliest and which was latest. But from the pottery that was in it, he saw an evolution of style. He saw changes through time, and he was able to more or less accurately date each of the tombs or put them into relative chronological order based on the style of pottery that came from them. So this was one of the early ways that we actually created artifactual seriation. But at the same time, we were also, Flinders Petrie was important because he was making this association between artifacts and what was going on in people's lives at that time. It's a perspective that we now refer to as the culture history model. Culture meaning the artifactual assemblage, the culture, the material culture that was in existence at that time, but the history of the way people lived their lives at that time as well. So culture history is sort of creating a history of, or a story of people in the past from their material culture. Now, you can probably already predict that it's very easy to create an overly simplistic viewpoint that pots don't necessarily equal people, right? And someone who uses a pot from a particular time period doesn't necessarily mean that they live their life a certain way. But it was an early attempt to try and crack the way people lived their lives in the past from material remains, which is hard to do. So culture history, while is often used to denigrate theories today, that's just a culture history model, it actually has a real place in what not only the history of the discipline, but also in creating things like seriations and relative chronologies. And in North America, this also was taken up, and these culture groups were classified by sites, and there was a large-scale thing called the Midwestern Taxonomic System, which was kind of like rules for the way that ancient societies fit into. So what kind of culture are we talking about if it has these elements? And what kind of a culture are we talking about if it had these kind of elements? And so the Midwestern taxonomic system we don't really use anymore, but it was a way to try and develop culture histories through formal schemes, through a formal set of rules that we could just sort of take all the artifacts and punch it through some type of a calculator, and it would come out with an answer to our questions of who we're talking about. Now, the nuances of these theories and methodologies were in the first half of the 20th century developed by a very important archaeological figure named Vere Gordon Childe. Now, I have a personal affection for this scholar. He was the founder of the archaeological program that I did my PhD at the University of Edinburgh. And He is still regarded as being one of the most important archaeological theorists of all time. He did almost all of his work before the invention of radiocarbon dating, so he was only dealing with relative chronologies. There were no absolute chronologies that he knew of until his final years. But one of the things that was really important about Gordon Childe, was that he was absolutely devoted to the study of antiquities, and he was a true culture historian, and he would travel to museums around the world, and museums would send him things to look at, and he had an absolutely encyclopedic knowledge of antiquities from around the world, especially Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. And because he had seen almost everything that there was, he had read almost everything that had been printed at this point in the early 20th century on archaeology, he was able to recognize patterns in archaeological collections all over the place. So he would say, that looks like that. There may be some connection there, that this group probably knew about this group, and they interacted. And so he talked about things like diffusionism. The kind of diffusionism that he promoted, we've sort of tamped down a little bit, that maybe there aren't as many connections as he was seeing. There was probably more indigenous development that just evolved on parallel lines. But importantly, he was seeing these culture histories as collections of people that were differing societies. So it wasn't just an artifact making connection with another artifact, it was two types of societies connecting. And that was very influential in trying to understand some of the changes that took place through time. And he emphasized a couple of different very important time periods in the human past that he really devoted his efforts to understanding. And these are worldwide global phenomena, which he referred to as the Neolithic Revolution, which is when people first started to settle down in villages and domesticate plants and animals. And the Urban Revolution, when you start to see cities and complex urban societies like state-level societies. And they're called revolutions not by accident. He was a devoted Marxist, both politically and philosophically. Marxism, I'll talk a little bit more in my supplementary video and lecture, because it's extremely important to archaeology for reasons that I'll get into later. But Gordon Childe was explicitly creating a link between Marxist cultural materialism, historical materialism, and to archaeology. So he was taking a Marxist view of the past and superimposing it onto archaeological communities and the way that we actually understand the changes in human cultures through time. Now, I mentioned that Gordon Childe was not around for the real revolution of absolute chronologies, because he died before Willard Libby's experiment really started to take hold. He knew about it, but he died before that started to change things. So, but you can imagine how revolutionary, how much of a change it would be to say this is earlier than this is earlier than this is earlier than this. Relative chronologies do a great job, but they don't actually tell you any calendar dates. How much earlier? How much earlier? How much earlier? How long does it take for these processes to take place? Well, from the late 1940s and especially into the 50s and 1960s, scientific methods of studying the past started to advance very rapidly, including absolute chronologies. And this meant that we weren't just focusing on the study of ancient societies, not just the description and the classification of artifacts, but also on how these societies were. Our mosaic became more clear, right? We weren't just taking all these facts, all this data, and just throwing it out on a table and trying to get a picture from it. We were actually able to find where those pieces fit so we could have a little bit clearer picture. So archaeology as a science started to be injected, rather than antiquarianism and just curiosity about the past, we started to look at the past through scientific eyes. Now, there are some major philosophical debates about how you do science that I don't really have time here to get into, but the ones that one important point that your book highlights, because it's part of the history of the discipline, is the difference between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. And essentially, the difference between these things is inductive reasoning is more or less a bottom-up approach. So you look at all of these facts, all this data, and then you try and draw a conclusion based on them. Before the 1960s, all archaeological work focused on collecting site data and then extrapolating that to a culture, like we've seen with Gordon Childe. That's inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, involves drawing particular inferences from general laws and models. So in this sense, in a social science, that would be how do humans behave? What are the sort of factors that are weigh in on how communities organize themselves? It involves hypothesis testing. You posit a general hypothesis to explain the data that you see there. And this is characteristic of work in the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, that sort of thing. This can be described as a top-down method of understanding. Now, this scientific method and deductive reasoning became the hallmark of what was called a processual archaeology. And Louis Binford, in particular, an American archaeologist, famously said, "Facts do not speak for themselves," and that we have to ask the appropriate questions to learn anything about the past. So this is deductive reasoning, coming up with hypotheses that you can then test with the facts that you've collected. And how do you get from these static artifacts into living, breathing processes? That's where the name processual archaeology comes from, the processes in the past. How did people pick up their feet and move around and interact with one another and that sort of a thing? And having more data doesn't necessarily help, because you still have to find a place for where that data fits in. And so he emphasized that archaeology must focus on deductive scientific work. Binford also promoted something called middle range theory, which was sort of allowed archaeologists to make statements about past processes based on observations made on present archaeological materials. So in other words, things like ethnographic examples, things that we see happening today, and then the artifacts that we see in the past, we can sort of come somewhere in between. That's what the middle range theory is that we're actually trying to come close to the truth based on what we can observe happening and what we observe has happened. So you observe processes in the present and you analyze material patterning left by processes from the past. Alison Wiley suggested that induction, bottom-up, is also valid as scientific process, and that science is not either induction or deduction, but it can be both, because what you're really trying to get is inference from these data, and there's varied ways to get there. So one way to organize your thoughts on this middle range theory is through what we call systems theory, that a system is an interconnected network of elements that together form a whole. So I asked a question to start this course. How would you describe your own world, right? How would you describe yourself to somebody? That's what anthropology is trying to do, and it's hard. But one way that you might actually do better than just starting at, okay, I am a person, I live in this location, and I start going through facts, it doesn't really tell you very much. But if you say, I exist in this system, maybe this political system, or this religious system, or this cultural system, or this ethnic system, you can say that there's a bunch of interconnected elements that form a whole that is not just the pieces, but it's not just made up of elements. It's actually the way they all interact. And this is what culture is, right? Culture doesn't just exist as an object, it exists between our brains. So the new archaeology that came out of processual archaeology was applying this systems theory to the study of past societies. So it was looking at the processes from the past and interpreting them as the material remains left behind by social systems. And this can be used to explain the feedback loop of changes in the archaeological record that result in changes from interrelated aspects of culture. Now, this processualism in new archaeology has some problems, and they were pointed out by some archaeologists in especially the 1970s and 1980s. Ian Hodder is one of the leading figures in what's called the post-processualist movement. And this posits that archaeology is a social science, not a hard science. And you can't really treat humans from the past like you can treat molecules or physical phenomena. So it's not physics, it's not chemistry, it's a social science like anthropology. And we should emulate historians and anthropologists in interpreting the past rather than emulating scientists. And Hodder thought that we should understand the past not from our perspective, not by looking at things that we observe and our assumptions about the way the systems operate, but actually try and understand how someone in the past would have understood their world, how they would have described it. And this is an anthropological concept that is the difference between what's called emic and etic. Etic is the outsider's view, the scientist's view of something, and emic is the insider's or participant's view of a culture. And Ian Hodder stressed that what we're really trying to get at is the emic viewpoint. What would an insider in the past world how would they have described their world? And he thought that the scientific process of generating hypotheses and testing them was not valid, and that everything should be put into a context of its own, and it's not something that we can actually test in our modern world of what was going on in the past. That actually each of these little elements, each of these data points needs to fit into its own contextual world from the past and requires a dynamic interpretation therefore. And he rejected the concept of an objective truth. So there is no truth in the past according to post-processual archaeology. There are many truths. And what we're trying to get at is an understanding of how people might have seen those. Now, part of this post-processual process is what's called hermeneutics, or the hermeneutical spiral. And it's pretty central to their theory of interpretation. And it stresses the interaction between the presuppositions that you bring to a problem and the independent empirical reality of observations and experiences. So you take your biases, you understand them, and then you look at empirical reality understanding those biases that you're bringing them to them, then that comes back and feeds into your biases, and then you do it again and again and again. And so it's constantly querying the data, constantly asking questions about what you know and reinterpreting them, and acknowledging that you are not an impartial observer. You're not just a robot. You are bringing your own biases to the interpretation of the past. And there's a diagram in your book that shows this hermeneutical spiral. So, new archaeology tested archaeological hypotheses, whereas hermeneutic archaeologists come with pre-existing knowledge and questions, and they have an open-ended cycle of continual inquiry. And different presuppositions could mean different things, different interpretations. These, of course, open the way, post-processual archaeology opened the way to things like feminist archaeology. These are, we all have intrinsic biases because we are people. We actually live our own lives and we have our own perspectives. And so feminist archaeology isn't just interested only in women in the past, but it looks at things like gender, and men have gender too, and there are other genders that exist today and in the past as well. And so gender archaeology and feminist archaeology bring up new types of ways of looking at the past that aren't just from the perspective of the way history has traditionally been done, written by men about men from the past. And so it focuses how archaeologists look at different topics. Feminist archaeology isn't just about women. It's about a perspective of bringing in acknowledging our own biases and trying to get to an emic understanding of the past from a range of underappreciated or understudied aspects of what is real human life today and in the past. So things like how archaeologists study gender, but also how we view men as active agents of change and women as just passive followers along. That's being challenged by feminist archaeology. And what happens in society depends on how and who and how you research. So it actually, understanding the past from that perspective can then impact our present, because we now think of ourselves differently by understanding where we came from differently. Also, post-processualism opened the gates, although I should say processualism was also interested in the processes of human agents, but post-processualism also embraced individual people's contribution to the past, because it was an emic perspective, remember? So the assumption in agency theory is that the basic unit of archaeological interest is in the individual, not just